Hello and welcome to today's video. In today's video I'm going to be discussing presumptive bullet pointing, specifically presumptive bullet pointing for behaviour. In the previous lecture I discussed presumptive bullet pointing for questions and speech styles. Today I'm going to be going over presumptive bullet pointing for the behaviour of an interviewer or someone you're debating. For those of you who don't know, presumptive bullet pointing is where you presume and you bullet point what an interviewer or a debate partner is going to do. What you do is you think of a response to the behaviour or questioning style beforehand, and then normally you're better able to handle things like hostile interviews or rude behaviour. Without further ado, I'm going to get onto it, and you might not find that all the things I'm going to suggest are helpful. However, if there's something specific that you're struggling with in debates, in interviews, feel free to email me and I'll try and do a response video that's more specific. Rude comments. Right. If you're doing a debate, you shouldn't really be getting rude comments, especially if it's well moderated, but inevitably these things happen. So normally in a debate, someone will make rude comments about you that are subtle within their debating point. Sometimes they can be quite on the nose, if you will, that if you're debating a sensitive issue, someone might start personally attacking you. And what you do, it's quite simple. You've got two options. You can either call it out or ignore it. If you call it out, it's important to do it in the right way. So if someone in their comment has just, in their speech or section of speech or argument, has made a rude comment about you, it's important just to stay calm, take a breath, and don't interrupt them, listen to them, and say something along the lines of, please can you refrain from insulting me personally because I think it's very childish and unproductive. That's how you call it out. You don't call it out midway through when they're talking and interrupt them. What you can also do is, if it's an interview that's public or it's a debate that's public, when someone makes a rude comment, you can engage the audience. So for example, if someone says that you hate homeless people and you're debating whether or not street begging should be criminalised or not, if someone goes for a personal attack and says, oh, you hate homeless people, or my opponent clearly hates homeless people, just shake your head and make sure the audience can see it. And that can be quite a good response. But generally, rude comments aren't really going to harm your case. So a lot of the time it's very productive if someone makes rude comments during their argument just to let them do it, because most right-thinking people will see rude comments as incredibly childish and incredibly immature. So there's an old saying, give someone enough rope and they'll hang themselves. And that's really what you want to do with rude comments, because if someone starts it, you don't look like a fool or weak if someone is making rude comments to you, especially if you politely redress it. But a lot of the time it can be quite effective just to let someone insult you, and it's important that you don't rise to it. So when you're making your arguments or your counter arguments and your opponent has been insulting you, you just ignore it and pretend that it doesn't affect you or it hasn't been said, because what that will do is it will show the audience who the adults are in the room. There are some exceptions to this. For example, in certain circumstances that are relatively small and few in number, it will hurt your case being insulted by your opponent or interviewer. But that's normally not necessarily an insult. It's normally a joke or some kind of well-timed quip, which I don't think you should really be too worried about, because most people you're going to be debating, provided they're provided someone who you're debating or being interviewed by isn't going out there with the intention of humiliating you, and you shouldn't really have to worry about well-timed quips. So someone making a joke about what you've just said. I mean, that I would put in rude comments. And I'd say someone making a joke or a quip about one of your points is, if you don't address it, it can be quite damaging. So the way you address a joke about one of your points is you make one back. So if it's a debate or an interview, you consider the likely jokes that someone could make about your points, and you have a rebuttal. I know this might not make sense to some people, but if it's this is quite hard for people to do, so it doesn't come up that often. Most people don't make jokes that are actually funny about points that you make in a debate. So if someone does make one that's actually funny, you've either got two choices. You can either roll your eyes or you can laugh at it. Laughing at it is probably the best thing. But then again, it really depends on the situation. So I would consider, when you're doing a debate or an interview, you make sure, or you consider possible jokes that can be made about your point and have some kind of rebuttal. Interrupting. During an interview, people shouldn't be interrupting you. Or during a debate, they shouldn't be interrupting you, but unfortunately they do. So if it's a debate and someone decides to interrupt you, the moderator should deal with it. If they don't, and someone tries to interrupt you mid-point, what you do normally is you raise one finger or a hand and speak very loudly and say, "No, just a minute, you can come in after I've finished." And normally that works. When someone tries to interrupt you, it's important that you don't let them have the frame, if you will, and be too loud, be louder than you. So you really need the shock. So if you're talking at a normal pace or slightly above normal pace, you don't necessarily want to shout, but you want to be very loud and clear. And normally slowing down your command and say, "No, just a minute," is far more effective than just rushing through it. So saying no slowly normally works to stop someone interrupting you. And a good hand gesture, like a solid palm or one finger, is normally quite an effective way of stopping someone from interrupting you. Of course, it can be in your benefit to let someone interrupt you. So if someone's going to make a stupid point, I understand it's not always easy to tell, but this is where, if you're being interviewed comes in, or you're debating someone who you've researched, let them interrupt you, and if they're going to make a stupid point, let them make it. But the problem here is, letting someone interrupt you is great when they're going to say something stupid, but even when they're saying something stupid, you don't want them to interrupt you that often. So if it's a 2-hour debate or an hour-long debate, it's probably only going to be effective if you allow them to interrupt you once, and then the rest of the time you don't let them. So if someone is doing an interview with someone like Piers Morgan, he interrupts you all the time. Allowing him to interrupt you once and say something really stupid can be a good thing. However, if it's the whole interview and Piers Morgan is interrupting you and saying, "No, what about this? What about that?" when you haven't even completed a sentence yet, then it's going to be harmful to your case. Because what normally happens is, yes, Piers Morgan looks like a dick when he does that. However, you don't get to make your case, and you're essentially wasting your time. So maybe you can let someone interrupt you twice, but generally I'd keep it to once. And it is quite hard to tell whether someone's going to say something stupid. The normal cues are emotions. So if someone's really angry at you for what you deem not to be a good reason, let them interrupt you once is probably the best guidance I can give. But if you have a specific scenario that's constantly reoccurring, feel free to email me or leave it in the comments and I'll get back to you. I'll probably do a video on it. Physical gestures. People normally use physical gestures when they talk. I certainly do. So, if you know what physical gestures your debating opponent or the interviewer uses, it can be very useful to learn when they use those gestures and how those gestures correlate to their emotions. So normally, when people are really anxious, they move their hands quite quickly. Normally, not in all cases, but in most cases. So you can get into some quite subtle manipulation techniques in terms of what pace you use depending on what body language, not really body language, but physical gestures your debate partner or interviewer is making. So if someone is giving very frantic gestures and they otherwise look quite anxious, it's probably, depending on what your goal is through the interview, to change your pace accordingly and your volume. Because what that can do is, especially if someone's anxious, a slow and consistent pace in answer to a question they've just asked can calm them down. Whereas if you want to make them go nuts, what you do is you respond to their frantic gestures by raising your voice and talking more quickly, which normally will create or further feelings of anxiety within the person who you're debating or is asking you questions. So it really depends on your goal. I've done videos on how to create certain emotional effects. So if you want more information on how to make someone feel sad, or not sad, feel joy or excitement or feel calm, then check out those videos. Right. I didn't realise how common this was, leaning over to try and interrupt someone or try and shut someone up. But it's not just Piers Morgan who does this. Piers Morgan is really bad for this. But other people do it as well, especially in panel discussions, and I don't actually like it. Well, I'm all for doing it if you're going to interrupt someone and make a very good point. However, it is quite rude. So, Piers Morgan in Good Morning Britain will lean over to shut someone up and reach their arm over their mouth, and that's quite a symbolic thing, and it normally encourages someone to stop talking. So the way you counter that is, because it's a very physical gesture, and the physical gesture is linked very closely to what is being said, if someone tries leaning over you during a speech or a debate, if you can, prevent them, block them with your arm. And if someone does this a lot, normally they'll be quite shocked that you've done it and they'll stop interrupting you. So the lean over is a relatively short thing and easy to encounter, but normally you can also tell when someone's about to interrupt you by how they're about to lean. So the best way to stop someone interrupting you, especially if they're going to do the lean over and interrupt you, is catch it early before they've said anything or moved a lot and just say, just a minute, or come to you in a minute. And I think that's quite effective. Ideally, you don't want to be blocking someone with your arm, because normally they'll have started talking. But generally, having mechanisms to stop people interrupting you is a really good idea, because you don't want people interrupting you all the time. However, sometimes it can be helpful. Thank you very much for watching. There's no homework for this video. Actually, there is. The homework for this video is to watch Good Morning Britain when Piers Morgan was on it, and hopefully that should be of help to you. If you've got any questions, comments, please leave them in the comments, or I think you can email me directly.